The scapegoating becomes a primitive form of self-harm. It's as though the narcissist is punishing the other person out of an inner rage about what the narcissist, him or herself, is lacking. I know that feels like a whole lot of psychobabble, but given how paradoxical and venomous that scapegoating can seem, you recognize that it comes from a deep, dark place within the narcissist. Let's talk about scapegoating. Here's the thing. Every bully needs a victim, and every narcissist, sadly, needs a punching bag. And anyone who has ever had a narcissistic parent knows about scapegoating. Because if it didn't happen to you, it likely happened to a sibling or the child in your family system. The scapegoat gets the worst of the narcissist. They take the hardest psychological blows. And since the narcissist needs to take his or her insecurity out on someone, sadly, wherever there's a narcissist, not too far away, there's a scapegoat. Scapegoating is a common dynamic in narcissistic relationships. It typically involves a person zeroing in on one person and blaming them for the things that are happening to them and giving them undesirable things to do. They may insult them, they may belittle them, they may devalue them, and treat them differently and always more poorly than they do other people. The scapegoat becomes sort of a repository or a bucket that receives the narcissist's rage, anger, and misery. The scapegoat is typically someone who antagonizes the narcissist in a very specific way. And there are multiple pathways through which scapegoating happens. The narcissist perceives the scapegoat as someone weak or undesirable. They perceive the scapegoat as a threat, or they perceive the scapegoat as vulnerable, perceiving the scapegoat as a reminder of the worst parts of themselves. So let's break these down. The simplest version of scapegoating is that the narcissist scapegoats the person that they perceive as somehow weak or undesirable. This is in many ways a sort of classical bullying presentation. In a family, the weak or the undesirably judged scapegoat may be the child or the sibling who is the most sensitive, who may be physically small, or for some reason physically or psychologically or intellectually considered less desirable for some reason by the narcissistic parent. For example, it may be the child that least resembles the parent, or has an appearance that doesn't conform to the parent's sense of attractiveness, or doesn't study the things they want them to study in school. And in an intimate relationship, this type of scapegoating may happen if a partner is deemed to be empathic or kind, and over time may be devalued on the basis of physical appearance, for example, just normal aging. In a workplace, it may be an employee who is just kinder than the others and who may not conform to the workplace narcissist schema for how a person should look or be. But in this model, the scapegoat is considered less than. And in some ways, that likely serves as some sort of twisted rationalization for the narcissist. It is also quite possible that the always insecure narcissist preys upon whomever they perceive is weaker out of fear, because the narcissist is afraid of their own weakness. And in that way, it becomes an interesting form of projection. A second form of scapegoating also derives from the classical form of bullying. In this case, scapegoating someone that the narcissist perceives as a threat. In this case, the narcissist goes after the person who may be better than the narcissist, someone who's smarter, more attractive, more successful, stronger, younger. You get it, you know? So the insecure narcissist will then attack, insult, and differentially abuse that person. But the narcissist may not even recognize that they think that person's better. Now, this is classical in narcissistic family dynamics when one member of the family is outshining, for example, the narcissistic parent. And the threatened parent then belittles and minimizes that child. In a relationship, this dynamic may also arise if the non-narcissistic partner starts having greater career success, for example, or makes more money. In a workplace, this may happen when it becomes clear that there is a person who is more quick-witted than the resident workplace narcissist or narcissistic leader. Narcissists cannot just make room or welcome the idea that we all have our strengths. They are threatened by anyone who is good at what they do or who may be better than them. They need to scapegoat and remove or silence the person or the persons who are a threat. Scapegoating also happens when the narcissist perceives someone as being vulnerable or too willing to share emotions, which they see as weakness. This is similar to narcissists scapegoating those whom they perceive as weak, but this is just a little bit different. A healthy person who is self-aware and open with their emotions may stumble onto a narcissist in his or her life. And because narcissists are so afraid of emotion and they're so afraid of true empathy, in some ways, they may even perceive this emotionally open and vulnerable person as a threat. Scapegoating may be manifested as sort of shaming the vulnerable person for sharing their emotions, or inappropriately sharing about the vulnerable person's emotions with other people. And that might happen in a family, in a workplace, or in a relationship. Ironically, the vulnerable person in this story, the scapegoat here, is actually the strong one. But it feels very devastating to be scapegoated simply because you're emotionally open. But that's just too much of a threat to the narcissist. But overall, the most compelling dynamic that has the deepest psychological roots is that the narcissist perceives something in the other person that evokes a strong emotion in the narcissist. And it's something that the narcissist is uncomfortable with in him or herself. And this can either be very linear, a narcissistic parent, for example, scapegoating a child who is not good at sports, or it can be paradoxical. A narcissist scapegoating someone who is able to succeed in something they cannot do well. So for example, an example would be like the narcissist scapegoating the really warm and loving spouse that everyone loves being with because the narcissist knows at some primitive level that people don't look forward to seeing him or her, but they sure as heck do love seeing the wife. The scapegoating becomes a primitive form of self-harm. It's as though the narcissist is punishing the other person out of an inner rage about what the narcissist, him or herself, is lacking. I know that feels like a whole lot of psychobabble, but given how paradoxical and venomous that scapegoating can seem, you recognize that it comes from a deep, dark place within the narcissist that doesn't really conform to any rational reason. Not, honestly, that there could ever be a rational reason for being chronically unkind to another person. Scapegoating does tremendous harm to the person that's impacted by it. If you were scapegoated as a child by a parent or other family members, it can be catastrophic. It can erode your sense of trust and safety and foster a lifelong sense of anxiety. Children who are scapegoated feel ostracized and excluded, a dynamic that often haunts them well into adulthood, and they often always feel like they're not good enough. But I will tell you this, one thing that can often save the scapegoat is that they're often more willing to fly away and get away from the toxic family system as adults, just to get far away from that space. And being scapegoated, obviously, in a workplace can also be traumatic and very unsettling and result in all the negative long-term effects of working in a hostile and harassing workplace. Now, certain work cultures that are about oppression and being the best and sort of a bro culture can also foster a scapegoating culture where supporting a leader who is abusing another person can be enabled by silently allowing the scapegoating to happen. Sadly, in narcissistic systems, people are often grateful to not be the scapegoated one. So they may simply keep their heads down lest they become the next victim of the narcissist scapegoating wrath. And sadly, that can keep these systems in place. So why do narcissists scapegoat? For the same reasons to why bullies bully: insecurity, having to put on a false show of strength by lashing out at the person who represents a threat or who represents an easy target. The core insecurity of the narcissist means that acting out in that manner may communicate to the world that the narcissist is actually strong when inside they are weak and they are insecure. It's also linked to the dynamic of projection, whereby the narcissist projects their unresolved conflicts and internal anxieties onto those around them, especially the targets that trigger the narcissist's insecurities. Now, I'm going to tell you, if you are observing a child being scapegoated, please step in and protect that child in any way you can. Even if you can't fully address their family dynamic, at least let the child know that what he or she is experiencing or hearing about him or herself is a factor in the other person and not a failing in the child. Many scapegoated children needed to hear that as children from just one other adult in their world. Many people who have been scapegoated sometimes even just go with it and feel that it is the only way that they can even be noticed in a family or other system. It's like they're going to just keep playing to that scapegoated role to be noticed. Again, we must advocate for those who experience this kind of abuse. The narcissist will not stop doing it. So we need to protect those it is happening to, whether it's a child, in a workplace, or in your family. And if you are an adult and can escape the scapegoating situation, then do your best to get out, or at a minimum, set boundaries, go gray rock, or just somehow psychologically distance. The scapegoating loses its power when you don't engage with it. And if other people are quietly standing by and letting it happen, you may want to start disengaging from them as well. They, in fact, may not be narcissistic, but they showed that they were willing to be silent in the face of you, or frankly, someone else being oppressed and scapegoated. And I don't think that's okay. Scapegoating is a classical dynamic in narcissistic families. People who are scapegoated are at risk for choosing partners who treat them dismissively as well when they are adults. And the scapegoating in a family doesn't just stop because you are no longer a child. Scapegoated kids often turn into scapegoated adults with the same sort of patterns of family mobbing and other abuse plaguing you over time. You must remain of this dynamic. You must remain aware of this dynamic in your family or your workplace, and recognize that you must also be your own advocate and distance yourself from whatever tribe it is that enables the narcissist to maintain this pattern. Now, being a scapegoat does not define you, or being scapegoated does not define you. You always have the choice and the right to step away from the scapegoating situation if you can do so safely, and recognize that you are so much more than that. Trust me, and sadly, they will move on to their next scapegoat in quick order. And I'm sure you're thinking, oh my goodness, I so wish I could protect that person from happening. Honestly, the most important advocacy you can do is the advocacy you do for yourself. In so doing, you may be able to protect others, maybe not from this narcissist, but from other scapegoated situations. And if all of us can engage in that kind of bystander behavior, intervene when we sense this kind of scapegoating happening around us, we do run the chance of at least making a dent in this incredibly toxic and damaged dynamic. Let's answer this question. What does the narcissist do when they lose their scapegoat? Well, for any of you who are currently or have been a scapegoat with the narcissist, this is a question that comes up a lot, because there's a lot of fantasy around it, like what happens when they no longer have me? Let's break it down. And I would also love to hear from you. If any of you were the scapegoat and you did finally find a way to step away, what happened when you stepped away? It's very, very, very hard for the scapegoat to pull away from the narcissist. The trauma bonding is so intense. But let's talk about it. The scapegoat, to be the scapegoat, this is a term that is most often used to describe the role somebody has in a narcissistic family system. It's the person or people in a narcissistic family system that get the worst of the narcissistic person's abuse, and because of the triangulation, the narcissist is often able to recruit other family or other members of the family system to perpetrate more abuse against the scapegoat, who over time becomes the punching bag for everyone in the family system. The scapegoat is subjected to criticism, mockery, humiliation, rage, sometimes physical or other forms of abuse, and becomes the repository of the narcissist's shame. It's as though the mere existence of the scapegoat brings out a sense of shame in the narcissistic person, and so they abuse the scapegoat even more. Now, scapegoating can happen in other narcissistic systems as well, including workplaces, groups of friends, or even other kinds of organized groups, community groups, any kind of group. It's only since there's a narcissist sort of in that system and there's someone that they're taking something out at, there's a scapegoat in it, right? The narcissist in some ways gets their power from other people watching fearfully at what is happening to the scapegoat and wanting to avoid that fate for themselves. And just like in any cult, other people get pulled into the narcissistic person's magnetic fold and join the scapegoating for any number of reasons: to win over the narcissist, to keep themselves safe in the system, to survive, perhaps to get their own power in the system. And because some of the people who join into the scapegoating are narcissistic themselves. To be a scapegoat is an absolutely terrible way to have to spend a childhood. It impacts attachment, it generates core wounds, it impairs a sense of safety in the world and identity development. Scapegoats may experience significant anxiety, not only in childhood, but also adulthood, self-devaluation, issues with self-esteem, holding limiting beliefs about the self, mood symptoms like depression, and basically scapegoats will spend a lifetime selling themselves short and often don't fully enact their potential. In more severe cases, scapegoated children, as they become older, may be at risk for even more dangerous behaviors, including self-harm, substance use, disordered eating, and other forms of dangerous acting out. It is an incredibly heavy, painful legacy to carry. However, though, here's the million-dollar question. What happens when a narcissistic person loses their scapegoat? It's really quite interesting because in many ways, the narcissistic person uses the scapegoat to regulate. The narcissistic person is incapable of regulating disappointment, frustration, stress, or just basically not getting to get their way. So they lash out, and they lash out at easy targets, and the scapegoat is often an easy target. As I said, for any number of reasons, the scapegoat often evokes shame in the narcissist, which obviously leads to rage. And that shame will get multiplied because the narcissist is aware at some level that their treatment of the scapegoat is not okay, and they keep doing it, which in essence, again, the narcissist knows at a deep, unprocessed level makes them a horrible person, and they can't tolerate that idea of being a horrible person, and so bang, more rage, inevitably directed at the scapegoat. I gotta say, some of my favorite stories of narcissistic abuse survivorship are when I hear about the scapegoat walking away. It sends chills down my spine and joy into my heart. Because of the trauma-bonded nature of the scapegoat-narcissistic relationship, it's one of the hardest things a person can do. Walking away may not always be physically walking away and leaving the situation. It may, in some cases, be mentally cutting out. But I got to tell you, physically getting out completely is really fantastic. It does happen. It's not easy. Now, when it does happen, when a scapegoat leaves the narcissist, a few things happen. First, the narcissist now has to find a new way to regulate. Now, initially, they will continue to lash out at the scapegoat, even if they're not there. They'll say, "Who do you think you are? Where the hell did you go? Do you really think you're going to be able to make it in the world without me? You're a loser. You're going to be back." They'll say those kinds of things. That can go on for a while. It might happen by text or email, social media. And the scapegoat has to be steadfast and be willing to block as much of this contact as possible. At some point, if the scapegoat can be resolute and not snap back, then the narcissistic person needs to find a new person to abuse. Now, there is that day, if the scapegoat's gone, the narcissist may find some new targets, perhaps the enablers in their midst, or someone else they devalued, but that was originally spared the worst of the narcissistic person's abuse because the scapegoat was around. The scapegoat is why narcissistic people often still have people around them, because they were all spared the abuse. But when the scapegoat is gone, then we may see that the narcissist needs to yell at someone. So now more and more people start seeing how bad the narcissist behavior is. Some may even try to pull the scapegoat back into the system for no other reason so that they can stop being yelled at by the narcissist and the scapegoat can take the punches again. If you're a scapegoat, don't fall for that. Smear campaigns often arise when scapegoats leave. Instead of attacking the scapegoat to their face, the narcissistic person may then use triangulation, criticism of the scapegoat on public spaces like social media, or honestly to anyone who will listen, maybe even making stuff up about the scapegoat. Anything that will allow the narcissistic person to regulate and to keep using the scapegoat as a punching bag, even from a distance. Sometimes the narcissistic person just deflates. Without an outlet for their rage, it continues to whirl around inside of them and just turns the narcissistic person darker and more deflated. Ironically, because many scapegoats are not only trauma bonded, but just too empathic for their own good, the scapegoat may feel pulled back in by the manipulation and the hoovering, or they may step in because they want to protect the people who are now being abused by the narcissist because the scapegoat is no longer there to be abused. Those other people, scapegoat reminder, those other people can get out too. It's not your job to save them. No human being should ever have to be a psychological punching bag for another person, to have to be the pacifier or the regulation tool for another human being. Nobody. That's the narcissistic person's damned responsibility to get some therapy, get a grip, take some personal responsibility, and stop using the world as their emotional toilet. And to the scapegoat, remember that you owe the narcissistic person, and frankly the people around them, nothing. And I mean nothing. It is an act of defiance, courage, and humanity to step away from a narcissist who abused you in this way. You deserve so much better than what they did and are doing to you. So I hope you heed that, because let's face it, at the end of the day, someone else is going to take the narcissist's rage, or it just eats them up inside. Do you ever wonder what happens to the scapegoat when they grow up? And that's what I'm hoping to be able to answer today. Family roles are so important to understand because it can really set us up to understand what happens to us in terms of our roles in adult relationships. All of you know the family roles if you've been listening to me, and so much of my work in this area around this has been to describe these roles and help people understand familial narcissistic abuse and how it affects them in adult relationships and in adult roles. So I want to start with the type that our many surveys that we've done across seminars and whatnot have shown to be probably what's the most common family role in a narcissistic family system, and that's the scapegoat. The scapegoat is the person that gets the wrath of the narcissistic parent or parents or other narcissistic extended family members. They are the ones that bear the brunt of the gaslighting, the invalidation, the rage. They're blamed for everything. And scapegoats often have a childhood characterized by walking every day on eggshells. So again, as you think about if this is you, what are the things that you experienced in childhood? And as this series slowly unfolds over time, I know many of you identify with more than one type. We'll talk about how those different types may affect you in adulthood. So let's talk about what happens to the scapegoat. The scapegoated child in the family system is the most likely to have the most significant mental health impacts of childhood. Remember, this is an entire childhood that has been pockmarked by manipulation, rage, emotional abuse, and perhaps also physical and other forms of abuse, by being gaslighted, and all of this can result in a wide spectrum of issues in adulthood, including patterns that we observe in complex PTSD, anxiety, depression, as well as a chronic state of living in self-doubt, self-blame, major impacts on self-esteem, difficulties with decision-making, and a daily mantra of feeling not good enough. There can also be long-term decisional or behavioral outcomes, and these can include things like maladaptive coping, as we call it, and those maladaptive coping is just bad coping, like using substances to cope, or other dysregulated behaviors, like using food to cope, using shopping, using gambling, any of that, and most pointedly, having difficulties in adult relationships, and choosing partners who replicate the invalidation cycle of childhood, choosing partners who recapitulate all of your mantras about not being enough. In addition, scapegoats tend to sell themselves short throughout their lives. They may not fully pursue educational or professional goals, still hearing their narcissistic parents' voice in their heads. Oh, come on, who do you think you are? Really, do you really think you can do that? Okay, let's see how you do at that. That contemptuous disregard for your goals. What I see most often for the scapegoat is the eternal cycle of unhealthy relationships, trying to work through the dysfunction of the childhood relationships through the adult relationships, instead of understanding clearly that that original family system, the family of origin, or that the people in it were narcissistic, and to recognize that it's not your fault, that these people are not going to change, and most importantly, that you did deserve better. Some people don't get that lesson or understanding until much later in life, having survived horrible adult relationships and often painful, expensive divorces, physically or emotionally abusive relationships, and constantly blaming themselves. Because that, to me, is the most painful legacy the scapegoat often carries: self-blame. Another issue that scapegoated people from narcissistic family systems can face is that in many cases, they may actually get stuck in their family of origin. They may get caught up in the narrative of hope that the family will change, or they will internalize the manipulation and guilt and keep feeling responsible for their family of origin. And so they may get fully stuck in the system, never feeling that they can go cast out on their own and find their own path in life and get away from the toxicity. And they may also forever feel responsible for this manipulative system that is all too happy to keep the scapegoat in their place and not allow them to become their full selves. But all is not lost. I really believe the scapegoat has very real gifts, and these gifts, if they can be dusted off and really regarded, can be a critical part of healing. Foremost amongst these gifts is that people who are in the scapegoat role are very empathic. Now, as a sidebar, I will say that there is unfortunately a small group of scapegoats whose personalities did get badly shaped by the post-trauma of the chronic psychological abuse of a narcissistic family. And in those cases, we could see a pattern that looks more like covert narcissism. So I do think there's a subset of scapegoats who go on to narcissism. But in the vast majority, there is a deep empathy, sometimes too much empathy. Maybe that is because as a child, they had a rich fantasy life around how they had hoped to be treated. Maybe it's inherent in the child who was the scapegoat because they were temperamentally empathic. And so that almost made them an easier target for the narcissistic parent because that scapegoated child, being empathic, would be less likely to fight back. People who had and who have that scapegoat role are often very, almost too solicitous and concerned about the needs of others, which may have been a learned behavior that they acquired to try to be safe in childhood, always serving the narcissistic parent's needs to avoid abuse and keep the family system a little bit peaceful. And always putting other people's needs before their own, which is not surprising because they were often raised to do that as children. However, in a healthy relationship, that warmth and that empathy and awareness of others actually can be a gift that scapegoated children may actually develop in adulthood. And there's another gift I really do see that scapegoated people have, although in order to access this gift, you often need a really good course of therapy with a therapist who actually understands trauma and narcissistic abuse. One day, whether it is to protect the child in themselves who was never protected, or whether it is because they actually enter, a scapegoated person actually enters a healthy relationship in adulthood and recognizes what healthy love looks like and experiences it, and even supported by their partner feels safer to set a boundary, or whether it's therapy and a therapist saying, what happened to you in childhood was not okay and you are not to blame. Or whether it's that scapegoated person just hits that wall and says, enough, whatever it is. People who are in that scapegoated role can actually become quite good at going no contact, or at least setting really, really firm boundaries and no longer engaging with their family of origin. Looking back on all the hurt and pain, they feel like, I don't know these people anything. In fact, my goal for scapegoated people is to really that they understand the dynamics of narcissism, especially in long-term relationships, and to recognize that it does not change. And especially when you find yourself in a scapegoated role, that they will see you as only that, not only as supply, but as a punching bag too. I really, really hope for scapegoats to recognize that they have always been more than enough, and that the constant manipulations of childhood were a projection by a psychologically stunted parent who projected their own inadequacies and insecurities onto their children. Once you fully, truly understand that, kind of shrugging your shoulders and either ending contact or at the very least minimizing contact and engagement to an extreme degree starts to feel easy. Because frankly, once the people who had these scapegoated roles can shrug them off, and maybe even gain meaning and purpose from the suffering of these roles, they really become our rock stars. They can become champions of the oppressed, they can become advocates, they bring tremendous empathy into the room, and they can often be really great bully slayers. And if people who were once scapegoated can trust their guts as adults, they can actually be the best red flag detectors in the room. I recognize that people who had a scapegoated role have really, really been through it. It can have been quite traumatic, and that these patterns in childhood can impact social and emotional development through the lifespan, as well as attachment and mental health. But I've said it before, I'm going to say it again. In the words of the great poet Rumi, the wound is where the light enters you. And in this way, anyone who has a history of having been scapegoated is often just brimming forth with light. Pay forward the empathy that you never got from your family. I promise you it will pay dividends. Just make sure you steer clear of the narcissists who are all too happy to snatch away that empathy and keep you in a scapegoated role. So for those of you who had that scapegoated role in childhood, I hope this actually is consistent with your experience. If you have had other experiences, that would be great to hear. But it was a wretched role to have as a child. And I will say, another important issue to remember about people who had that scapegoated role in childhood, they often go on to become tremendous parents. Because many people who were scapegoats in childhood vow that if they ever do get to be a parent, they will never do this to their own children. They can often be quite fiercely protective of their children. But it is absolutely essential that if you were in the scapegoated role as childhood, that you do at some point get access to mental health services. The scars, the trauma, the negative self-thoughts, all of that can really have a dangerous impact on mental health in adulthood. And it's so important to have a safe space to talk about that with a therapist who gets it, with the goal of ensuring that you don't replicate these cycles in adulthood, that you don't slide off into a place where you take on a more victimized role, and that you can step into adult roles informed with empathy and grace that come from having done some of your hardest yards when you were in childhood. I hope this was helpful. Thanks again.